So that means that people like me or my colleagues who are doing the research on the health effects of fracking, if they go into a fracked community and want to start talking to people and finding out, well, who's become sick, so they know whose blood levels to measure, they're not going to get a lot of information. So that also, so there's a couple of secrecies here, right? A couple of forms of silence. One is that they're exempt from federal laws that require them to monitor, so we don't have monitoring data, so we don't know what we're putting into the environment. Second, we don't know what ingredients they're using. Third, they have non-disclosure agreements and gag orders very often, and so those all together, that makes it very hard for us to figure out the consequences, especially now that fracking happens in densely populated areas. So, all right, so let's go back to the story of fracking. So you put this sand and this water and these chemicals down into the ground, and now up they come, right, like a geyser, because you put all this under pressure. Now they're going to flow back out, and that's called flowback. And so that fluid is now the same as when you put it in. So it's got all the chemicals that you added to the fresh water. You deliberately poisoned mass amounts of fresh water, used it to frack. Now it's come back out of the hole. But it not only contains all the chemicals that you deliberately added, but it also picked up on its journey to the center of the earth all these naturally occurring things. And a lot of those are heavy metals, because when these seafloors were laid down for complicated reasons, heavy metals that were once contained in mountains that eroded into the ocean got trapped in this layer of shale too. We're talking about things like uranium, radium, lead, mercury, arsenic, all those things right in the middle of the periodic chart of elements. And they tend to be very toxic. And as long as they're locked up in rock, a mile below us, they don't really hurt us. I mean, they're natural, and the fact that they hold a rightful place in the periodic chart of elements, but they're not natural in terms of, they're not normally part of nature. Nature, it tends to be a surface phenomenon, right, where we live. And so by bringing these things up, by exhuming them from the deep bowels of the earth, suddenly they're in our communities, right? And so all this flowback water, millions of gallons, has to go somewhere. And so it's often, all these heavy metals, normally not part of the natural world, are now going to be here on the surface, and they end up in kind of pits that are dug on the property that this flowback fluid has to be temporarily stored. And then eventually it's pumped into tanker trucks and hauled away. But of course, those are the same tanker trucks that we have. They share the same roads with us. So we're like now driving with these tanker trucks that are full of really harmful things. And some of those things are radioactive. So some of these heavy metals that come up, like radium, are pretty strongly radioactive. And so there's no requirement to measure the radioactivity. And we're just going to put this stuff on trucks and drive it right past our houses and so on. So that's one angle of it that we in the scientific community are trying to get a better understanding of. And these trucks crash. I mean, they just crashed the other day in Pennsylvania and sent fracking fluid, flowback fluid, into creeks that are going to go into rivers that somebody's drinking water downstream somewhere, right? So it's an inherently dangerous issue. And because you have to frack with such large volumes of water, we're talking about at least 1,000 tanker truck trips per well. And to make fracking work, because there's so little gas, we're talking really about tiny bubbles scattered horizontally. In order to make fracking profitable for the industry, you have to put wells every few miles across the whole landscape. So essentially then our communities are turned into staging grounds for a massive industrial operation that turns the earth inside out and releases all these toxic chemicals into our communities that we would otherwise have no exposure to. So fracking is the only industrial activity I know that doesn't stay on its own side of the tracks. I mean, it's not like there's the industrial zone, where we're going to have the factory. If the factory floor is our community, and there's no rules or laws that says you can't put a wellhead right next to a daycare center, right next to a church, a hospital, a nursing home, the airport, and so on. And so that, I think, the non-zoningness of fracking is one of the reasons you see this now massive human rights movement that's sprung up to resist it. So the anti-fracking movement, of which I'm a part, the kind of scientists in residence with it, is just getting started, but the momentum that it has and the speed at which people are organizing is pretty phenomenal. For example, I was recently asked to be an adjudicator for a grant program by which these mini grants, very small grants, so $600, were going to be made available to community groups who were fighting fracking in their community. And the thinking was that maybe we would get 200 applicants and we had money to fund 50. So I was going to look over the 200 applications and choose 50. And part of what I judged, was supposed to judge things on is, do the folks applying have a kind of basic understanding of the science, and do they have what's their plan? Are they going to educate their church group? Are they going to have a letter writing campaign for their town board? Or how are they doing this? And so we ended up receiving more than 1,000 applications, and so money was actually made available to fund 200 applicants, and those people, and I could have funded almost all 1,000. I mean, they were from all 50 states, right? Because even states that don't live over the shale play may be mining the silica sand, and they're experiencing health effects from that. Even people in Ohio where there's no fracking going on, they're receiving the fracking waste because it's being dumped into their community. So people are fighting and there are people fighting pipelines, people fighting all kinds of different infrastructure projects, these big compressor stations and so on. So essentially we're talking about the mass industrialization of the entire of rural America. We're talking about shattering our bedrock of our nation to bring out, at best, 6-year supply of fossil fuels, and then it's gone. And then people who come after us are just left with the mess. So it is a kind of gold rush, and it has a kind of gold rush mentality, by which I mean to say that people are blinded by the idea of a windfall of profit, and they can't see the long-term consequences, which may be more expensive than the one-time inflow of cash. And so in places where the shale plays have already played out, like in Pennsylvania, what we're seeing now is that people made far less money than they anticipated. The jobs dried up and went away. All this temporary housing and these motels went up to house, the influx of workers from out of state. They're all gone now, and the hotels are empty. And so what follows then is the bust. The bust always follows the boom, and it's a kind of period of social blight. And then some good sociology has been done to show us that it's not just chemical exposures, which is what I know about and what I study, but it's also when fracking comes into a community, you change the actual interactions between people. And so when you have an influx of out-of-state workers, what goes up is drunk driving rates, drug abuse, so new drugs often get introduced into a community because these workers, it's a very grueling kind of experience, and a lot of them stay awake because they're asked to work very long hours using methamphetamine or other kind of drugs. This gets introduced into the community, starts showing up at the public schools. Rape, violent victimization goes up. Housing for single mothers starts to drop off or become more expensive, and then you see as a direct consequence of that, increased number of children going to the foster care system because mothers are now homeless and they're giving their children up. And so those are then permanent problems, right? So my argument about fracking is that it brings temporary riches to a few, permanent ruin to many, and apart from the long-term health problems, there's a democratic unfairness issue here that we need to redress.